Thank you, Cindy. Thank you for the love that you show me and my family and all of us. Like if you come to one of these events and Cindy opens, you're like in tears from the introduction. So thank you for seeing us in the best of who we hope to be. Thank you to the Center for Biographical Research for doing this, for opening up this space, and for the forum. And I think, and for students and for all of us, like every human being is a universe. And when you dig into someone's story, into your own story, you find the cosmos, all of it. Mm-hmm. Like every part of humanity that makes us glorious and vile and hopeful, abhorrent, all of it. Like it's in our histories, it's in our story. And so thank you for this and for inviting me to do this talk and for giving me deadlines, which my partner Cameron will say is like very useful. It's something that I've wanted to do for a while, and so I appreciate it. I'm gonna tell a story of who I am and how it's influenced how I understand the world, and I'm so grateful that my family is here and my chosen family who tell me every day how to make that real in our lives. So I'm the granddaughter of revolutionaries and refugees and artists. Again, whole, extraordinary, and perfect people who were shaped by the political forces of their time and the circumstances of their birth, but in some, I think, all refused to be indifferent to injustice and made tremendous sacrifices. So on this slide is my maternal great-grandfather, Victoriano Martinez, and his granddaughter. My mom is here. He was a sugar factory worker and a labor organizer in fascist Spain. And he was imprisoned for 7 years under Franco's regime when my grandmother was only 12. So this is the late 1930s, early 1940s. And when he was released from prison, he scaled the Pyrenees into France and with my great uncle, which is where my mom was born. And one of my grandmother's and now one of my own most prized possessions is this little knife that he carved out of a chicken bone when he was held in a cage. My grandmother kept it in her jewelry box and now it's in mine. And here, my paternal grandfather, Nadia Ben-Youssef, as Cindy said, a political leader and revolutionary in Tunisia's independence movement against France. And he was active in third world solidarity movements for collective liberation. And also, and I think this is important, really troubled by what he saw as sort of an emerging effort to really sustain the depravity of colonialism through neo-colonial powers. So yes, you have independence, but colonialism, it remains. And so he led a powerful movement, not only against France, but against Tunisian compromisers. And it was an uprising, and in fact, the movement is known as the Youssefistes. And I have a friend who's like, these hangouts, they should be called feasts, Youssefistes, which maybe they will be. Our salons will be feasts. But Youssefiste movement, and this is one of my favorite photos of him, in part because he's smiling, and I love that, but he's also surrounded by young people who were part of this movement, who saw sort of the boldest vision of liberation. He continued organizing in Tunisia even after his exile in 1956, and he was ultimately assassinated in 1961 by the first president of Tunisia, Habib Bourguiba. And we're going to get into that history, the tragedy of it, what it means, what it tells us, and how I'm trying to honor that sacrifice and that legacy. What's interesting about this, just for a second, like the intersections of these stories for me are still emerging. And even as I was preparing this talk, I realized that these two men were in prison during the same time. Mm-hmm. And fighting, of course, the same forces as we all are. But I'm going to focus today on the research that I've done over the last 15 years on Nadia Ben-Youssef, my grandfather, and the broad anti-colonial movement of the time, and what lessons it offers us. So I started this research in 2011 when I was living in Palestine, and it's in the midst of the Arab Spring. Folks are familiar with the Arab Spring and the Jasmine Revolution, which began in Tunisia. In December of 2010, and Ben Ali was ousted. The dictator of Tunisia was ousted in January of 2011, and sort of created that domino effect across the Arab world. I was living in Palestine, and the love and energy for Tunisia was so overwhelming. And it was actually the first time in my life that I was identified as the granddaughter of my grandfather by an elder in Palestine. That August, so 2011, in August of 2011, I met my father, my uncle, and my grandmother in Tunis for the 50th anniversary of his assassination. And the interim president of Tunisia, his name is Monsef Marzouki, was there at my grandfather's grave with us. And it was the first time that there was really a genuine recognition of his life and legacy by Tunisian presidency, by the authorities. Because this moment was like a national reckoning. As much it was sort of like an overthrow of the dictatorship of the time, it was also an uncovering of another history of Tunisia. And on the streets, like here, like women, students, activists, civil society were making sense of this sort of like lie of independence. So Tunisia had had two successive dictators. The first president of Tunisia, Habib Bourguiba, was deposed by Ben Ali, the second dictator of Tunisia, and people were starting to ask real questions and realizing that a core part of the history was that there was another path forward. That what people were experiencing now, the indignities, the injustices of colonialism, of dictatorship, were not inevitable, and that there was another movement alive that was really thinking about freedom fully for Tunisia, for the rest of the world, that our ancestors had paved a totally different path. We just hadn't known it. It was really, really buried intentionally. A dear friend and comrade who you all know, I think, Julian Agin, introduced me to this concept, the Chamorro word for this, which is lumuhu, which is to return to one's path. To return to one's path. And what was happening during the revolution was a return to the path that had been buried. So I have since, in the last, it's like 15 years, it's like difficult to, time passes so quickly, but I have since been sort of doing my own uncovering of this history. And we'll talk a little bit about why and how the trauma of state violence sort of silences generations of people and families. But, you know, I did a lot of work. I was meeting with elders. This is Habib Limsi, who was a freedom fighter, Yusufist, really young when he was organizing with my grandfather, and so had a lot of like beautiful stories. He visited our family in Egypt when we were in exile. Neda is an activist, a student activist on the streets of Tunisia, and an economist, a brilliant thinker and scholar who has helped me make sense of Tunisia now, and also was one of the first to say, like, we didn't know this history until the streets. Like, the streets told us this history, and so here we have, you know, many things, video projects, things, interviews with my family, digging in archives, translating speeches, and recommitting to the future that our ancestors wanted for us. So I'm going to share a few key moments of my grandfather's life. And I do this in a linear way, and I'm looking at you, Chuck, because Chuck, if you went to Chuck's brown bag lecture a few months ago, saw he did vignettes and of his life and moments, and had I had more time and more fluency and fluidity with this story, I would have loved to do that. Like, but in this moment, I'm going to go from, you know, sort of his birth and his organizing and political life, and then his afterlife. But, you know, I hope that there are pieces of these stories and moments that stick with you and that resonate with you. I remember often a quote by James Baldwin, and maybe you talk about it in the Center for Biographical Research, which he says, you know, you think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, and then you read. And you realize that your greatest heartbeat is what ties you to all of humanity. Your greatest joy is what ties you to all of humanity. And so, yeah, let this be an offering to you too. This story has, in explicit and implicit ways, informed my own life and work as a human rights advocate and a lawyer, and my purpose as a co-conspirator in all of our struggles for justice, especially the struggles for land back, for decolonization, and for dismantling human hierarchy in all of its forms. And so I hope that the story is just an offering to all of us and gets us just a little bit closer to freedom. MAKTUB, the title of this talk. Why this word? It means it is written in Arabic, and it's a word and our idea that I really love personally. And not because we're just passive recipients of some intelligent design, because that often feels so horrifying, especially in the great tragedies of our lives, but because it invites us into a purpose, into a story, into a struggle that's in motion. That's in motion. It is written. It is written. For me, personally, MAKTUB is the intergenerational truth of the Black Panther leader, Fred Hampton, who said that you can kill the revolutionary, but you cannot kill the revolution. My ancestors direct my steps, and we're planting seeds for the next generation. My daughter, our children will know this history and carry on. And in the context of the global struggle against colonialism, I also read into MAKTUB a spirit of indigenous refusal. That whatever they want us to believe, the world we have is not fixed. It's not inevitable. A world order premised on the lie of human hierarchy is not the end of the story, because freedom is our inheritance, and it is written. Nadia Ben-Youssef. Another image that I really love, that I was holding on the way to the transitional justice process that I'll tell you about in a bit. Nadia Ben-Youssef was born on October 11th, 1907. It's interesting because, to go to sort of family trauma, I didn't know that date of his birth for such a long time. I knew the date that he was killed. And we thought about the date that he was killed. My father would mark it. We wouldn't have celebration. We knew that date. We didn't know October 11th, but now I know. He was born on the island of Djerba off the coast of Tunisia. And Djerba is a really interesting island in North Africa. It's home to an ancient Jewish community, the second oldest synagogue in the world, a multicultural, multi-religious island that would forever inform Salah's politics. He was sent to the capital in Tunis when he was 8 years old to pursue an education in Arabic and French before attending the Sorbonne in Paris to study law. And his nationalist organizing began there, where he established the first cell, or sort of what's a cell, like a cadre, like a little group of the first cell of the Destour, or Constitutional Party. And he also began forming relationships of solidarity with membership in the Association of North African Students in France. So you start seeing sort of the Arab students gathering together in France. When he returned to Tunis in 1934, this is a picture of him in 1934. He helped found the Neo-Destour Party, so the New Constitution Party, which was more nationalist, more militant, less elitist, and he quickly rose to the ranks of Secretary General of the party. And together with the majority of the leadership, he was imprisoned in 1938 to 1943, both in Tunisia and in France. So this is the overlap with my great-grandfather on my mom's side. And when he returned to Tunisia, he spent the next 7 years really building out the party, establishing cells across the country, organizing with labor unions, women unions, the Arab Scouts. So how do we build power across communities by chance? And because it's important, he also married my grandmother in 1947. From 1950 to 1952, he served as the Minister of Justice of this new government in Tunisia. The head was Mohamed Chneik, and this was a government that was formed basically to deal with the question of France. Like, it was a government that the colonial power, so French was the colonizer in Tunisia was saying, okay, you all need to figure out how we're going to negotiate either this ongoing or evolving relationship. And Tunisians had ideas about what that meant, which meant leave. Leave us alone. And because France wouldn't budge on that, the party began an international strategy. And my grandfather turned to the UN, which was only 4 years old at the time. And the UN was really a new institution. I mean, it's amazing to see people and colonized people trying everything. Like, let's try everything. Okay, there's another institution, we're gonna try this institution. And they were building momentum. So of course, France dissolved that government in March of 1952 and imprisoned all of its leaders. My grandfather managed to escape Paris and ultimately ended up in Cairo, which would be his first exile from Tunisia for the next 3 years. And those next 3 years were vital. And this is like a key lesson for me, and I hope for all of us. And it has some resonance with what I know and what I'm learning about Hawaiian history, and the really robust and brilliant strategy for recognition, and how that played into sort of a reflection of sovereignty from the outside that also bolstered sovereignty movements internally. So the next 3 years, it's super important time in the development of his political understanding, and it was a period of deep relationship building across geographies and expressions of transnational solidarity. So he went to the UN, as I mentioned, a number of times, in Paris, in New York. He was at socialist gatherings, this one, a socialist gathering on the upper right-hand corner in Sweden. He was in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, in India, Indonesia, and started dreaming with people that he was meeting, that he was sitting with and breaking bread with and walking land with, about gathering the multitude of the world. What would it mean for us all to gather together and show force together and dream an alternative world together? So this is the seeds of what would become and what would be known as the Bandung Conference, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. But as this sort of transnational movement was growing and solidarity was being expressed, at home in Tunisia, similarly, the armed resistance was gathering strength. And so there was resistance from within, pressure from outside, and France was losing control. And this is a little bit of an aside, but I think an important moment in Tunisian history, and probably also for us as organizers and as thinkers. It was the victory of the Viet Minh forces in 1954 in Dien Bien Phu against the French, a humiliating defeat for the French that forced France to start negotiating with its colonies. So a win for anyone is a win for all of us. Like, seek those victories out because they have ripple effects. It's like the butterfly, you know, like what was happening there mattered in Tunisia. And so this is actually when Tunisia had to start thinking about what it was calling internal autonomy with France. So this is in 1954. Okay, so now here we are in Bandung, which is like a seminal moment. Let me see here. Bandung. So this is April of 1955. My grandfather was the head of the North African delegation, so Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria together, all French colonial holdings or colonies, French colonies. It has been described as a crossroads of history, a conglomeration of the world's underdogs, a moment of miraculous unity. Sukarno, the president of Indonesia, described the mood at the time in his opening address as a hurricane of national awakening and reawakening that has swept over the land, shaking it, changing it for the better. It was a remarkable week for many reasons, some very tragic for Tunisia, the anti-colonial movement, and for our family, but I want to just appreciate the boldness of Bandung. Truly a remarkable, extraordinary moment. By the end of the week, the participants had drafted a final communique, which was basically an indictment against empire, from 2/3 of the world. 2/3 of the world said, we reject empire, we reject colonialism, and the sort of economic subordination and the cultural suppression of our people. They uplifted nations who were still under the boot of colonial rule. So in fact, it was organized by 29 newly independent countries Bandung, but was attended by people like my grandfather, the North African delegation, others who were still fighting colonialism. And it's often sort of that piece of who was there is often sidetracked. I think it's really interesting that it was both people who were on the other side of the freedom movement and those who were still in it. They declared support for Palestine in the final communique. This is again 1955. They called for economic and cultural cooperation across the third world. They called for the right to self-determination and defense, as well as respect for human rights. And then in what was a milestone for the peace movement, and we have peace activists with us, the conference considered nuclear disarmament fundamental to the preservation of world peace. It's a really beautiful consolidation and consensus of our demands as people. I have just a few pieces of writing of my grandfather in English, but during the conference he gave 2 press statements that revealed to me the depth of his commitment to collective liberation and his rage at anything less. So, this is a great slide. I forgot to say something about it. I'll say something about it. This was so dope because sometimes when you're reading history or you're in the archives, you find like really the gems. And Richard Wright, I wish that Shankar was here because it's a travelogue that I think wrote a travelogue called The Color Curtain. Richard Wright was in New York, saw that there was a Bandung conference happening in Indonesia, Asia-Africa conference, and was like, I have to go. And Richard Wright went to Bandung and recorded in this beautiful travel log. And here he said, I don't know, where the history speaks to you. He was on the plane and he saw all of these North Africans join the plane in Cairo. And my grandfather, and you'll see a photo of him soon, wears a shishia, which is the red, here he says fez. Fez is more Turkish, but in Tunisia we call it a shishia. From Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, climbing aboard the plane, revolutionaries and nationalists. And as the constellation roared into the dark toward teeming Asia, I heard excited voices discussing Palestine. And I was like, you know what? Like, yes, MAKTUB. Like it's there, it was in his commitment to our freedom as a humanity. Like we have to discuss, never stop discussing Palestine. Anyway, so I love that slide. It's not in my, but here's back to the press statements. So he said, you know, in it's very blurry, but I can learn how to do this better. The delegation, so this is the North African delegation, thanked all of the nations who were assembled for supporting Morocco and Tunisia. The issue was that people were getting scared by the revolution in Algeria and the armed resistance in Algeria. And they were trying to separate Tunisia and Morocco from the revolutionaries in Algeria who were taking up arms against the French. And in this statement, my grandfather says, fundamentally, the problem of French colonial domination is the same. So if you support us, if you support Tunisia and Morocco, you have to support Algeria. Mm-hmm. Which in the end they did. But I love that moment because it's a reminder just we cannot throw people under the bus. Mm-hmm. And people must be allowed to resist colonization. Mm-hmm. And so I love that moment. That was the opening statement and he was so excited to be there. But then, on April 21st, 1955, so right in the middle of the conference, this was a turning point for our family's life, but also for our country and for our collective struggle. Habib Bourguiba, who was leading the Neo-Distor Party together with my grandfather, a longtime comrade of my grandfather's, who would ultimately become the first president of Tunisia. He went forward while all the revolutionaries were in Bandung to sign accords with France and granting France internal autonomy over Tunisia. And so the accords limited Tunisian French rule. This was happening in Paris. Limited Tunisian self-rule, self-government, and essentially said, here's the sort of incremental path towards independence. We're not going to do it all at once. We're going to have control of the defense. We're going to have control of foreign relations. French settlers would maintain the right to property. There would be separate judges for the French. We would continue close economic ties, which means sort of extraction and exploitation. My grandfather, 3 days later, so this is April 24th, he had received a telegram in Bandung. And he said, at this moment, when the historic Bandung Conference, grouping together nations representing 2/3 of the people of the world, has just manifested in a spirit of unanimous enthusiasm its full support to our demand for national independence, and has urged the French government to fulfill our rights without delay, the Tunisian people are more justified than ever in their rejection of this fake autonomy, completely devoid of any reality. So annoyed, enraged, betrayed. Like, what a profound betrayal. What a profound betrayal. And I think the other piece is that he immediately recognized and would dedicate the next 6 years of his life to this larger threat and the emergence of neocolonialism. Because damn, where decolonization suddenly was also very clearly not an exit into sovereignty, but instead an entry into a global political scenario that shared structures and protocols with the former colonial era. It just wasn't different, right? It was adjusted, but the powerful nations were finding new ways to continue the pattern of colonialism and maintain their aspirations of political, economic, and ideological control. And then there were willing collaborators. And these were his close comrades. So when he returned to Tunisia in 1955, you can imagine the mood. He continued building and organizing a resistance not only against France, but now he was organizing against Tunisian forces who were compromising with the colonizer. He went all across the country, building up this movement. The majority of Tunisian people and the majority of the political party, so over 700 of the 1,200 cells that existed across the country, joined this resistance, saw the reality and the path this way, refused it, started taking up arms, building a resistance. They joined. So this group was called the Youssefistes, as I mentioned, and the compromised minority who was backed by the French army, Bourguiba. They were known as the Bourguibistes. So there's something that has happened in that sort of configuration where there are forces that are trying to distill this as like a conflict between two men, and not a national civil war that it was, of people who were fighting for liberation and those who were choosing to side with the colonizer. And I love this photo so much because this is my grandfather on the right, Habib Bourguiba in the middle, Munsif Shadi, I believe, on the side, but don't quote me on this. But you see sort of a difference in their orientation, in their dress, in their commitments to their people. and you see the comprador bourgeoisie in Habib Bourguiba, right? Like, we're wearing a suit, we're palatable to the West, we're French, we'll be your partners in this. And my grandfather, just like in his jalaba and his shishia, being like, what's this? I love this photo. And just a word about the photographer of a lot of the photos that you saw, including that really beautiful one. I think this is so stunning, and the guy in the tree, and it's just gorgeous. And his name was Mohammed Nadia Ben-Youssef, and he actually took the name Ben-Youssef in honor of my grandfather, and that's part of the movement, of the Youssefis movement. So just a beautiful, we have so many photos. So I need to work with you, Malia, or Art, on just what to do with all these photos. Violence mounted in the fall. So as sort of 1955 is shaping, he was ousted from the party that he helped to build in October of that year, which he refused to accept. And in November, there was a lot of sort of armed resistance happening, and many of his closest comrades were murdered, including Nadia Ben-Youssef, the photographer. He was shot on November 29th, 1955, and martyred on December 2nd. And so I think about him a lot when I see these photos, and the gift that he's given us, and the power of artists, which we'll talk about as well. Like, to document history, to document the truth. They too are part of the revolution, and they too will be silenced and are often on the front lines because what they're trying to tell us is the most important truth. So a lot of violence. He escaped at the end, in the early part of 1956. So there was a lot of talk about assassinating Nadia Ben-Youssef, and he ultimately fled to Libya, and my father, his brother, my grandmother left Tunisia shortly after and arrived in Cairo on March 13th, 1956, which is how many years ago? 70 years ago on 2 weeks. And then he continued to mobilize from afar in support of a vision of collective liberation, attacking the new president, Habib Bourguiba, all the time, for undermining not only the Tunisian anti-colonial movement, but that of Algeria's as well. My grandfather was sentenced to death twice in absentia. And even from refuge in Egypt, his vision of a completely different world was such a threat to the status quo of neocolonialism and liberal internationalism. And in 1961, Bourguiba ordered his assassination. He was killed at a hotel in Frankfurt, Germany, and my family remained refugees in Egypt until Bourguiba was deposed in 1987. And his legacy, I mean, this is in the New York Times, so there was a lot of talk about what was happening and what it meant, and I think a lot of fear of what that movement was, foretelling for all of us. But this legacy really remained unknown and certainly unspoken, even in our family, until the revolution. The revolution forced the establishment of a Truth and Dignity Committee, who released a report investigating state crimes from 1955 to 2013. And they looked into the case of my grandfather. My sister is here, I should say our grandfather also. The commission charged 6 people with his political assassination, including the first president of Tunisia, Habib Bourguiba. And we have been participating in a court process ever since. At another moment, if folks are interested, and maybe there are some sort of people thinking about human rights, thinking about the law, I'm happy to discuss the limits of these transitional justice processes, and how tragic it is that Tunisia is, again, under the boots of dictatorship and the whims of the West. But for now, we'll pause that, maybe if there are questions, if there's time. Okay, and now I'll share a little bit about my own work and the lessons for us, and hopefully we can have a chance to chat. I referenced this a couple of times, but my father spoke very little about this history. We had photos of my grandfather around our house, and my grandmother certainly, as the families of martyrs tend to do, but little understanding of his life and legacy. And I've talked to our cousins, and my grandmother lived with them in Egypt, and similarly, there was a lot of silence, a lot of fear. But there's also MAKTUB. I'm a human rights lawyer by training, and I spent nearly a decade working primarily to advance Palestinian liberation, a central feature of Third World solidarity and struggle in the 1940s and 50s, and of ours. Tunisia and Djerba, as I mentioned, was once a thriving multicultural society with Tunisian Jews central to our identity as a people. Zionism has taken so much from the world, including the existence of Mizrahi Jews, or Jews from the Arab world. And the earliest public statement I have found of my grandfather's is in 1934, so he was just back in Tunis from time in law school. And he was leading a march under the banner of "The Jews are our brothers." a sentiment he repeated in Djerba just before he was exiled in 1955, where he encouraged his Jewish neighbors and siblings to stay in their homeland and join the common fight against France. The question of Palestine was central to my grandfather's political commitments. Freedom for Palestine, a core demand in Bandung, and is still a pillar of politics and organizing in Tunisia. With the Samud flotilla, and we have a flotilla member here, proudly finding refuge in Tunisian ports last summer. In the summer of 2014, I returned to the US to begin working seriously on shifting US policy and opinion on Palestine. And I have said, in reflection of the last period of my life, that I met my grandfather in Ferguson. The summer of 2014 was a moment of historical convergence, of struggle, Palestinians resisting another devastating war on Gaza, and Black people leading a generational uprising in the US against the brutality of racist state violence. The forces we were all fighting were so clear. The path forward was also singular. We had to choose each other in the deepest, most lasting way. This is the first Dream Defender delegation to Palestine, and Haoli just came back 10 years later, 11 years later, and still sort of building and insisting on deepening these connections with Black and Indigenous activists and leaders and scholars with Palestinians. So you see that on the left. And then here is the Vision for Black Lives in 2016, which makes an explicit commitment to freedom in Palestine as core and fundamental to Black liberation and freedom in this country and in the world. And really, I think, was one of the most significant political developments since the Oslo Accords in 1994, because it shifted everything. It shifted our organizing, it shifted what we thought was possible, and I think it has shifted the tremendous momentum that we have seen in opposition to the genocide in Palestine now, and how many communities are seeing this as their struggle and their commitment. So we were building these relationships. I established, as Cindy said, Adala Justice Project in 2017 under a clear strategy of de-exceptionalizing Palestine. So the opposition for years and decades had succeeded in really cordoning off Palestine from every other struggle. Like, it was too complicated, it's not like anything else you've ever seen before, it's a topic only for PhD students, or policy wonks, like it's nothing that you can discuss. And we refused because we lived the resonance. Like, what was happening was so clearly a history and structures of oppression that we were refusing in every front. So we, at that moment, also decided to step away from the corridors of power and doing advocacy in DC or in New York, and just turn towards each other. And we spent years building relationships and recommitting to each other's freedom in a real and embodied way. In 2019, I'm almost through. In 2019, I joined the Center for Constitutional Rights as our first advocacy director, drawn to CCR, as Cindy said, for its history of solidarity with Palestine, for its consistent and coherent politics against US empire and militarism, and its accountability to people and not to the law. I've been building out the advocacy methodologies of CCR and thinking about all the levers we can pull alongside litigation, policy, political education, campaigns, and art. And just a few months into my time at CCR, the transitional justice process began in Tunisia. In the years after the revolution, my father and I both became enthusiastic keepers of our family history. And one of the most remarkable moments of my life was traveling to Tunis to watch my father testify before a court of Tunisian judges in the Transitional Justice Court, telling his story and ours out loud for the first time. And in this testimony, he spoke very little about the murder, save for the fact that Habib Bourguiba had ordered his assassination. He said it many times, Habib Bourguiba is responsible, Habib Bourguiba. But he spoke mostly about what cannot be killed. He spoke about his father's ideas, about the decolonized vision of the world he was promoting. He said that Tunisia and France had made a choice when they killed him, and Tunisians could make a different choice, to restore history, to finally upend oppressive colonial hierarchies that had remained in place. Recognizing political choice has been so significant to me as an advocate. The work that Chuck and Mari have done to help us understand that the law is a choice. It's not neutral. It's designed to protect the interests and the rights of some, to disenfranchise others, to suspend the rights of many. Colonialism, capitalism, neoliberal economic policies, these are all choices. What is possible takes place first in the imaginary. The world we have was imagined by others. And so we have to create a totally different reality. We can make other choices, but we have to imagine it first. Here are the lessons, and then we'll have a few minutes to chat. This is anti-colonial refusal as praxis. Imagining new worlds, building new structures. The world order doesn't work. The structures are not designed for us, and so they are illegitimate. They're not designed for us, so they're illegitimate. And we must build new ones. This is the audacity of a convening like Bandung, and it is our task today. And a word on the role of artists. I curated an exhibit at a conference in 2016, the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights conference, I think it was 2016. And the prompt was, I sort of imagine freedom, I think. This was in 2016. And the submissions were so revealing about how atrophied our imaginations are. There were lots of images of breaking chains. There were lots of images of cages. There was roses in concrete. There was destruction. People could imagine destruction of the old world, but it was so hard to imagine what will come in its place. What do we deserve in its place? And Najib's piece is what won, because this was like borderless. It's birds. And you could see how difficult it was for artists to do it, but they had to do it. They had to do it. My maternal grandfather, Félix Sampere, was an artist and an immigrant who modeled a commitment to excellence in his craft and in the quotidian. And he gifted all of us, his descendants, the clarity that art is central to our experience as human beings. Because artists can chart the future. They can see beyond what exists. They can help give shape and light and direction to our path. So the first is imagine new worlds and build them. The most significant, I think, is to build relationships and to live in solidarity. My father has distilled my grandfather's politics in this way. Liberation only comes with unity. And this is true. It's how we win. But it's not only strategic, because love is simply the answer. Deep, deep love. It motivates us, it clarifies and sustains every action that you will take in pursuit of freedom. We love each other so deeply that our struggles and our joys, their struggles and their joys are ours. Solidarity saved my grandfather's life many times, in prison, in exile, and it gave his life and mine meaning. From Hawaii to Palestine, to Tunisia, to Puerto Rico, to Guahan and the Western Sahara, and West Papua, from all occupied lands, the struggle is ours until freedom. Thank you.